Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 5 of This Week in Elections. We had a bit of a slower week last week in terms of elections, but this week it's really going to start picking up. So, first, we're going to start up with our recaps of last week. We're going to start in Antigua and Barbuda, where Prime Minister Gaston Browne's snap election gamble paid off in a huge way. His Labour Party didn't just win, another term, they turned a narrow majority into a landslide, taking 15 of the 17 elected seats in Parliament. Then we'll go to England, where Reform UK got one final boost before the big local elections, getting the Tenbury Award from Conservatives in a by-election that works pretty well as a preview for what we might see next week. We'll also briefly touch on the Manhattan City Council special election, where Carl Wilson's win became a pretty interesting proxy fight, you could say, in New York politics, and maybe the sign that Mayor Mamdani's endorsement is not automatically enough to carry voters or carry a candidate over the line. We'll also briefly touch on some of the recent House members that have either resigned and or died and how that kind of affects the balance of power currently. Then we will look to next week where we have a pretty massive week. We have the by-election in Farage in Australia on Saturday, which will really help to show and test the strength of one nation. There's the Texas Senate District 4 special election, which is happening tonight, Saturday, which is really going to show if the Democratic gains seen in Texas Senate District 9, if that's really the standard now for Texas Senate District specials, or if we're going to revert back to kind of traditional midterm year Republican president norms. And then the huge one is May 7th, next Thursday. We have elections across England, Scotland, and Wales, which are just going to show how successful reform is, how the Greens are doing. We have the SNP in Scotland. We have the Wales parties. We have how bad Labour is going to do and the possible implications that if they do, bad enough, that Starmer might resign. All of that. So yeah, it's going to be a fun episode. So let's get right into it. All right. So first up, like I said, we had the Antigua and Barbuda elections. And, coming into tonight, there wasn't much polling available, but it was kind of widely seen that this was just like an interesting choice by Prime Minister Gaston Browne to call this snap election like 2 years early. But it was a huge victory for him. The Antiguan and Barbudan Labour Party won 15 of the 17 elected seats in the parliament, and the United Progressive Party fell all the way from 6 seats in 2023 to just 1 seat this time around, and the Barbuda People's Movement held their 1 seat in Barbuda. In terms of vote share, Labour won with about 60.8%, the UPP fell all the way down to 37.3%, and the BPM won around 1.6%. And turnout was down this year at around 62%. So like I said last week, the big question was whether this snap election gamble was actually going to work. He called this 2 years early, and the ABLP really just scrapped by in 2023, and they only won. They had a 3-seat margin, but really only a 2-seat margin because if you convert the votes. And they won some of those constituencies, might I add, they won by 50 votes here, 100 votes here. It was a very, very slim majority in 2023. And in terms of the popular vote, they won it by even less. I believe it was less than 2 percentage points in 2023. And to go from that to winning by, what is it now, 23 percentage points, 23.5 percentage points, it's a massive swing in just 2 years. These individual constituencies really matter so much, especially when the parliament is only 17 seats. Like I said, a few hundred votes here and there can completely change the government for, years at a time. And I guess the really only positive or slight-ish positive showing for the UPP was that its leader, Jamal Pringle, did narrowly hold his seat in the All Saints East and St. Luke ward, which at least keeps the opposition from being completely wiped out. And Trevor Walker held Barbuda for the BPM, which is also pretty important because, Barbuda has its own political identity and has always been a constant problem area for Browne's party. But to be fair, that seat, All Saints East and St. Luke, I believe has not gone to the ABLP since 1999, I believe. So it's been a while since they won. So it was pretty expected that Pringle was going to win his seat. But yeah, like I was saying, besides those 2 seats that the opposition leaders won, the UPP's result was really brutal. They went from looking like a serious threat in 2023 to being reduced to a single elected seat. And now the issue is not that they lost, it's that this kind of loss usually creates a leadership crisis. When you go into an election, you're trying to prove that the government is vulnerable, and you come out with one seat, it's very hard to argue that you're doing your job as the opposition leader. And for Prime Minister Browne, though, this gives him exactly what he wanted, which is a stronger mandate, a fourth term, and I believe during his fourth term, he will become the longest serving prime minister in Antigua history. And it gives him a lot more breathing room in parliament. Before this election, Labour's majority was narrow enough that individual MPs mattered a lot. Now, with a supermajority of 15 out of the 17 seats, he has room to govern without constantly worrying about every little parliamentary move and whether, a single or two constituencies, if their MPs would vote against it. So the bottom line here is that, Browne took a real risk calling a snap election 2 years early, but it paid off massively. And Antigua and Barbuda went from looking like, a potentially competitive election between Labour and the UPP, but it was actually a Labour landslide, and the UPP survived only barely while the BPM held on to Barbuda. And now Browne has one of the strongest mandates ever. All right, now we're going to go back over the pond to England. Because we had one final principal authority by-election before the big local elections next week, and Reform UK ended the pre-local election period with another gain. In Tenbury, which is in the Malvern Hills District Council, Reform gained the seat from the Conservatives. Reform had 45.1% of the vote, while the Conservatives came in second with 30.3%. The Lib Dems were at 12.7%, and the Greens were behind them at 12%. So while on seat, this seems like just kind of the normal, Reform took another seat from the Conservatives, but what matters here is that this was exactly the kind of seat that Conservatives needed to show that they could still hold on to. It's not a Labour urban seat. It's not some, weird case where Reform comes through in the middle because, Labour and the Greens and Lib Dems are splitting the vote. This should have been a comfortable Conservative defense, and, if this was 2 or 3 years ago. But Reform beat them pretty comfortably, which is going to be quite concerning for the Conservatives coming into the local elections next week. Although, that being said, I'd still be careful about, overreacting to one ward by-election. Like I said, this is one local contest with local candidates, local turnout, and, local elections can be weird like that. But, as a final signal before the May 7th elections, it does fit into the bigger pattern we've been seeing, which is that Reform is still very capable of eating directly into Conservative territory. And the timing is also interesting. This is a week away from when thousands of council seats are going to be contested across England. So if you're the Conservatives, this is basically the last thing you wanted to see right before the election. Reform taking another one of your seats, with the Tory vote falling and the anti-Reform vote split between the Lib Dems and the Greens. I know there's also been a lot of debate online about how to judge Reform's performance next week. Some expectations guides have suggested that anything around 1,400 seats would be a disaster for Reform. But that doesn't really make sense because Reform is starting from such a tiny base that even winning, in the low thousands, like a 1,200, would still be a huge expansion for their local government presence. So I'd say looking forward to next week, it's not really, how many seats they won, but it's where they won, who they took them from, and whether they can really put some influence on these local councils. Because, if Reform wins a ton of scattered seats but doesn't take control of any, councils directly, it's one thing. But if they take chunks of Conservatives in rural and small town England's, that's a much bigger story if they can control some of these local councils. And if they start breaking through, more traditional Labour areas too, it's going to be really dangerous for both the big major parties. So just to wrap up Tenbury, like I said, it's only one seed, but it's a week before the huge May 7th local elections, and it's a final warning shot to the Conservatives that they might be in for a bad one next week. All right, coming back to the Americas, we have the Manhattan City Council special election, which was a council seat, District 3, and it ended up being a little more interesting than I think, a normal city council election would be. Carl Wilson has declared victory in the race to replace Eric Bottcher on the city council. Wilson was actually Botcher's former chief of staff, and he had the support from a lot of the local Democratic establishment, including the city council speaker, Julie Menin, Bottcher himself, a bunch of labor and elected official backing. But this race really got turned into a proxy fight. Mayor Zoran Mamdani, he endorsed Lindsey Bolin, who had support from the Working Families Party, which is like the progressive party in New York. and several figures of the city's more left-wing movement. So this wasn't, just like a regular council race. It became really a test of whether Mamdani's endorsement could carry real weight in a competitive contest. And at least the answer here is no. Wilson led clearly. This was a ranked choice voting contest, so he led clearly on the first choice votes, with Boylan behind him. But because none of them hit 50%, we have to go to the second round of ranked choice, which I believe is going to be May 5th. Wilson got 43.3% and Boylan got 25.8% of the vote. But if we look, in this race a little bit more, we see a couple of different things. First, Wilson continues the district's long tradition of openly gay representation. This district includes the West Village, Chelsea Hell's Kitchen, and the Stonewall Inn. So the LGBTQ political leadership is very important here. It's essential to the district's political identity. And this election shows that New York politics is not just left versus moderate in a simple way. Local relationships really do matter. And, labor parties matter. And labor unions. The outgoings member network also matters. The speakers network matters. And in these low turnout special elections, these things can overpower a more high-profile mayoral endorsement. I mean, I don't think, though, this should be a huge warning sign for Mamdani's endorsement power. I think that's a little bit too dramatic to say, but it does suggest that his coalition is not, automatically transferable to every race. Mamdani won this area in the primary and in the general election for the mayoral race. So while he couldn't, totally transfer his vote share to the city council race, there were a lot of other things going into this race. Like I said, like the backing from the former member. You have the city speaker's backing. Labor unions backing. So there were other things going into this race besides the endorsements. So the bottom line here is that, Carl Wilson will win this race after the ranked choice voting is finished and, beats the Mamdani-backed candidate. But again, it's a small Manhattan council race. So it's hard to extrapolate too much about progressivism versus moderates in New York. But Mamdani will have more tests. He endorsed in 2 congressional primaries, so we'll know in June. Obviously, we have Bradlander, and then I believe we have New York 9 he endorsed in. So we'll see how he does then, but I'm assuming he'll have a little bit more weight in a congressional primary rather than a small Manhattan City Council race. And then I just briefly wanted to mention some U.S. House member updates, I guess, this week. We've been having a lot of members go in and out recently. So I just wanted to mention that in Georgia, we had longtime Democratic Congressman David Scott, he died on April 22nd, which is leaving Georgia's 13th district vacant. And then recently, Governor Brian Kemp has called a July 28th special election to fill out the rest of his term. This is a very Democratic seat in the Atlanta suburbs. So this will be a Democratic hold, but it'll be interesting to see the candidates running, and again, left versus moderate, so we'll see what happens here. But I must say, I'm not trying to be insensitive to David Scott and his family, but I just wanted to add that David Scott did not even vote in the 2024 general election, and I believe it's been reported he hasn't voted in years. So I just wanted to remind everyone, make sure you know who you're voting for in your election and make sure that they're actually voting. Mind you, he lives in Georgia and did not vote in the 2024 election. Just keep that in mind. And we also had in Florida, Sheila McCormick resigned from the 20th district on April 21st amid ethics and legal pressure. Her scandal was that she stole FEMA funds. Again, people, make sure you know who you're voting for. She stole FEMA funds during COVID. But that seat is also very Democratic heavy. But like we've seen in the news, looks like Floridians are going to be redistricting and changing their maps again. So we'll see how the districts shape out. And I believe she said she wanted to run again. So, it's crazy. But so right now, Democrats are down 2 seats. So it helps the Republican majority slightly. They have a little extra breathing room right now. But most likely these seats will be filled by Democrats. I mean, obviously, we don't know in Florida what the maps are going to look like just quite yet, and if they will be legal. But there's just always house drama, so I just wanted to briefly mention it and not act like I didn't want to bring it up, or I just wanted to make sure these things are mentioned because not every politician's a good person, people. So for everyone's sake, let's hope the new two members who get elected actually vote and don't steal funds. All right, and that's it for the recaps. Like I said, it was kind of a slow week last week, but next week we are heating things up and we are going to start in Australia. Next Saturday, May 9th, we have the Farage by-elections, and Farage is a huge rural electorate in southwestern New South Wales, in this far southwest corner of the state. And the by-election was triggered by the resignation of former Liberal leader Susan Ley, which makes this interesting because now it is a real test for the new Liberal leader, Angus Taylor. And historically, this seat has been very conservative. Farage has been held by a Liberal and National Party since it was created in 1949, so on paper, this should be a Liberal hold. But the margin is not going to be as comfortable as it used to be. In 2025, Ley only held the seat 56.2 to 43.8 against an independent, after a 10-point swing against the Liberals. And that independent, Michelle Milthorpe, is also running again this time. And One Nation is running this time. So it's going to be a much messier by-election this time around. And what's also interesting is that the Liberals and the Nationals are running candidates, which is interesting because now this is a coalition versus coalition dynamic where you have a seat in which both sides of the Conservative coalition are going to be running candidates. And you also have the One Nation candidate and the independent. So you have you have three right-leaning parties, and Labour is not contesting because they don't want to split the anti-One Nation vote. Their fear is that, maybe if they ran a candidate, it would pull away voters from independents or people who might vote Liberal. They basically just want to lock One Nation out of even the possibility of getting first place. So the results going to be interesting. The current odds on Kalshi, which I know betting markets aren't the best, but it's interesting to see where people are putting their money. One Nation currently has a 75% chance, while the Independent has a 28% chance, and the Liberals are at 0.6% chance. So it looks like most people are assuming a One Nation win, but I think the margin's going to be really interesting here. If Liberals do somehow hold on, Angus Taylor can breathe a little bit easier. But if, Milthorpe comes close, or if One Nation runs it up and, wins, or even if the Nationals embarrass the Liberals by pulling off a serious chunk of the Conservative vote, this can become a much bigger problem for the Liberals and the coalition in general. There are a few polls that show One Nation in the lead in the second preferential vote. So there hasn't been a poll in a few weeks, but again, this election is next week, so we'll see how things go, and the margin's going to be really, really interesting. But this is the first kind of test for the One Nation Party in a major federal by-election, so we'll see if they can really get the job done here and win as people on Kalshi are expecting them to, or if they don't, if they are a little bit, if it's a bit of a disappointment for Pauline Hanson's party, but we will see next Saturday. And next up, we're going to Texas, where today is the Texas Senate District 9 election. This was the seat that Brandon Creighton gave up after leaving for to become chancellor of the Texas Tech University system. We have Brett Ligon, the Republican candidate, who is the former Montgomery County District Attorney, and the Democrat Ron Angelidi, who is a special education advocate and a first-time candidate. We had early voting that ran from April 20th to April 28th, and today's election day. And now, if I'm going to be honest, I do not believe this is going to be a Democratic flip. This is a very Republican district. It stretches from, the Houston area suburbs and exurbs up through places in Montgomery County and east towards Port Arthur. And, Donald Trump won this district by about 34 points in 2024, which makes this significantly redder than the North Texas Senate special election, which was in District 9. That seat was only Trump plus 18, I believe. So this is about double as red as that district was. But that earlier upset in District 9 is why people are kind of watching this one to begin with. In January, Democratic Taylor Remmett flipped that Republican-held Texas Senate seat, and it got everyone's attention because, specials are often where you see signs of early political of changing political environment, that is. But District 4 is just a much tougher target for Democrats. But Lincoln has the backing of former Senator Creighton, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and it's very much the establishment Republican here. So I think the real question is going to be the margin. If Lincoln wins by, 20 points or so, Republicans can say that the earlier election in January was kind of a bit of a fluke. But if Angeli keeps it pretty close, even if he wins or loses by 5 to 10 points, that's a huge cut in the margin. And Democrats can absolutely point out this as another warning to the Republicans coming into the midterms in November. So like I said, I really don't believe that Democrats have a shot here, but we will definitely have to look at the margins, because if they can keep this in that, 10, anything, honestly, anywhere from 5 to 15 points would be a very impressive loss, I'd say, for them. And huge warning signs once again for the Republicans in November. All right, and now we're going back to the UK for the big one, the UK local elections. On May 7th, England is holding a huge round of local elections with more than 5,000 council seats up across 136 local authorities, plus several mayoral contests. These elections are happening alongside the Scottish Parliament election and the Welsh Senedd election. So this is basically one of the biggest election days in the UK political calendar. And for England specifically, this is going to be a massive test of the party system. Labour is defending the most seats, which means they have the most exposure. Now, that does not automatically mean they're doomed when you hold a lot of seats, but you naturally have a lot more to lose. The Conservatives are in a different kind of danger, but for them, the issue is not just losing seats to Labour or the Lib Dems or Greens, it's losing them to Reform. If Reform starts taking seats directly from the Conservatives, like they did in Tenbury and like they've done in many elections or by-elections this year, it creates a nightmare situation for the Tories, because then the question becomes, how are they still the main party of the right in local government when they're being replaced piece by piece by Reform? And now Reform obviously has the biggest expectations of the night. If they win a lot of seats, people are going to say that they're breaking through. If they don't win enough, people will say they underperformed. But the baseline matters here. Reform currently holds very few seats compared to the Labour or the Conservatives, even the Lib Dems. So any large number of seats is going to be a huge major expansion and legitimization for Reform. And I think the Greens are the second most interesting party of the night. Over the past few weeks and months, they've keep shown up in, by-elections time and time again, getting, either taking seats from other left-leaning parties or cutting into Reform's vote share in some places. So it's going to be interesting to see, whether they come second compared to a more traditional left-leaning party, and how many seats they can pick up. People are predicting quite a lot for them as well. And it'll be a real test if the Greens can pull these vote shares from Labour and maybe, like we've seen in the polls, overtake them in, national polling. So we'll see how much damage they can do. And then for the Lib Dems, they're going to want to do what they usually do in local elections, which is to win in places where local organization, anti-conservative tactical voting, community level campaigning, where all those things really matter for them. Because, if the Conservatives are collapsing in parts of southern England, the Lib Dems should be one of the major beneficiaries unless the Greens can cut into that vote instead. So we got to really watch where the Conservatives are losing, and not just where and how many, but where they're going. Are they going to Reform? Are they going to the Greens? Are they going to Labour? We have to really keep an eye on where they're going. For Reform, we're going to look at those gains. How many are they taking from Conservatives? How many are they taking from Labour? How many councils are they actually taking control of rather than just winning a couple seats here and there? We're going to see how bad Labour does. They will lose seats, but the question is how many and how devastating it gets. That can really might tie into Keir Starmer. If they lose, 1,500 seats or whatever, this could be detrimental and it might trigger some leadership election. And then we're going to want to look at the Greens. They've been having a great streak recently, but let's see if they can hold it up in these local elections. And if they do, the conversation might start being Reform versus Greens rather than Labour versus the Conservatives from now on. Now, if you go north a little bit to Scotland, where voters are electing all 129 members of the Scottish Parliament, also on May 7th. Now, this is the first Scottish Parliament election since the 2024 UK general election, and it comes after a really messy few years in Scottish politics. The SNP, which is the Scottish National Party, won 64 seats in 2021, just one short of a majority, and then governed with support from the Greens through the Butte House Agreement. But since then, Nicola Sturgeon resigned. Humza Yousaf became first minister and then resigned after ending the agreement with the Greens, and then Job Sweeney came back to stabilize the SNP. So the SNP is still the same main party in Scotland, but it's not the same dominant SNP we saw at its peak. They've been hurt by scandals, leadership changes, voter fatigue, public service issues, and a general feeling that after nearly 2 decades in government, the party is just worn down. But the thing is, they still may be in the best position to win this year. And part of that is because of the opposition that's split. Scottish Labour should have had an opening after the 2024 UK election performance, but Keir Starmer's unpopularity has really dragged them down, and Anna Sawar had been trying to separate himself from the UK Labour brand so much that he literally called for Starmer to resign. And, that's not normal party management. And it's a really big sign that the Scottish Labour Party knows the national government is becoming very toxic for them. And there are the Conservatives, who are facing a serious threat from Reform once again. Reform currently has one MSP, which is a member of Scottish Parliament, because of a defection. And now they're trying to turn that into, real electoral breakthrough in Scotland. And their rise in Scotland will be particularly damaging to the Conservatives. And their rise can be really damaging to the Conservatives because it splits the Unionist right-wing vote. And if that happens in constituency races, it could actually help the SNP win on lower vote shares. So, if regularly, let's just say, if it was two parties that the SNP gets 40% and the Conservatives get 60%, maybe this time around, the Conservatives get 30% and the Reform gets 10%, and then Labour or the SNP stay on 40. That's a seat they would have lost by 20 that they're now winning by 10 because of the split in the Unionist right-wing vote. So that's the really big thing to watch here, is that the SNP might not need to be as popular as they used to be if, Labour, the Conservatives, the Reform, Lib Dems, if they're all dividing the anti-SNP vote in different directions. And once again, we're looking at the Greens here in Scotland as well. They could be heading for one of their strongest elections ever, especially on the regional list. And because the SNP and Greens are both pro-independence, the size of the pro-independence bloc matters almost as much as the SNP's individual seat total. So the question is really whether SNP can get close to or somehow reach a majority. Like I said, a majority is 65 seats. Last time they had 64 seats. If they manage to edge out an outright majority, they will almost certainly frame this as a mandate for another independence referendum, even though Westminster still controls whether one can actually happen or not. So the real big story in Scotland is a test of whether a weakened SNP can still win because of just how fragmented and split the opposition unionist parties are. We're going to see, once again, Reform go up, Conservatives go down. You got the Lib Dems, you got the Greens pushing through. Lots of parties, lots of split voting, and we could be seeing some interesting results because of that. So we'll see on Thursday just whose parties are really making the best pitches to the voters and what weird splits we're going to get in these seats. Now we're going to go to Wales, and this one is honestly huge as well. The 2026 Senedd elections is not, another Welsh election. It is the first one under the new electoral system. The Senedd is expanding from 60 members to 96, and Wales is moving to a closed party list proportional system, and the country is being divided into 16 six-member constituencies. So now voters are casting one ballot for a party or independent list rather than the old system with constituency and regional votes. So that means this election is going to be a bit harder to compare directly to past Senedd elections. The system's different, the map's different, the size of the chamber's different. So it's going to be a little bit hard to just compare with last time around. But the big story here is that Welsh Labour is under serious pressure. Labour has dominated Welsh politics for the entire devolved era. They have always been the central party in the Senedd. But after years of power, there have been multiple scandals, the decline in Labour's polling, and the unpopularity of the UK Labour government. This looks like this could be one of the most competitive Welsh elections ever. And we have some interesting challengers this time around. Plaid Cymru is trying to present itself as the serious Welsh alternative to Labour. They are pro-Welsh autonomy, centre-left, and they want to show that they can actually lead a government rather than just influence it for once. But Reform UK is polling also very strongly, and that changes the entire race. Reform has never been a governing force in Wales, but under proportional representation, they don't need to win traditional constituency-style races to win seats. They just need enough vote share across the new multi-member constituencies. So Wales can end up with a very fragmented Senedd. Just after the elections in 2024, the Welsh Labour Party was sitting at around 30% in first place. Looking at opinion polling now, they're sitting just around 16 or so percentage points, with Reform implied number 1 and number 2 very close together in most of the opinion polls out there. So Applied, they might come in first, but they're not going to have an easy path to governing. Reform can win a large block of seats and make make the math for a coalition much, much messier. And the Conservatives, who used to be the main opposition force, are fighting to be, pushed aside. And you also have the Greens and the Lib Dems, who are also trying to benefit from the new proportional system. And, Plaid and Labour have worked together before, but a formal government deal is not an automatic, assurance. Plaid might not want to just prop up Labour again if Labour has clearly been punished. And if Reform does really well, a lot of the post-election conversation would be less about, who won and more about who can actually govern. So the bottom line in Wales is that this can be the most consequential Senedd election in decades. With a new system, a bigger chamber, Labour is under pressure, Plaid has been taking the lead in many polls, while Reform is trying to blow up the old order. And we might have some messy coalition math if you're into that. So the Wales election will be one to watch, as well as the Scottish and English elections. I will have a more in-depth breakdown for these local elections, probably coming out either Tuesday or Wednesday next week, so right before the voting takes place on Thursday. I just wanted to briefly mention that next week we also have the Indiana and the Ohio primaries. So in Indiana, there's not really much of note. We're going to obviously take a look to see if any incumbents, if there's any, pushback for any incumbents and see if any challengers get real momentum, but not really much in Indiana. In Ohio, we have Vivek Ramaswamy run for governor, and he's obviously widely seen as the favorite. But, we'll see how he does. He has Trump support in large fundraising, but he's had a lot of criticism over some of his policy positions. So we're definitely going to see the margin on that race, although Ramaswamy is expected to win. And we also have a new congressional map for Ohio, so we're going to see what the margins are in there. And again, just see how the incumbents do and see if there's anything of note to mention. But we're just going to take a look at those two states next week to see if there's anything of note. All right, so that's going to be it for episode 5. Like I said, we had a bit of a slow week last week, but this week, again, huge implications in the UK, as well as we'll see how the Democrats do in the Texas Senate special. So it's going to be a really telling week in the UK and the US. And I will see you guys either Tuesday or Wednesday. I'll make a community post once I get that video done. And then we'll be back again for episode 6 on Saturday. So be sure to like, comment, subscribe wherever you're watching, and have a good one.